Okay,
All right, we're
Ready?
recording now.
we're
Yeah.
recording. Okay.
So this is Paul and Kim and Steve in our weekly Death Digest conversations about death and dying. Today we're going to talk about one of Steve's ideas, which is that it doesn't matter what questions we ask about death. At the moment of death, all the relevance of those questions will completely disappear. And we're going to talk about that today as part of our first series of recordings on death and dying. So Steve, did I characterize?
Yeah, my idea is that death is a transpersonal experience, and so it's beyond all our questions. It's beyond questions and answers. So I think they essentially become irrelevant at the moment of death. So death is beyond that. It's not that our questions are answered at death. It's just that the questions become irrelevant.
So I'm not sure I understand why the questions are relevant, except that at the moment of death you're dying, and now we're alive. Is it because what changes at the moment of death that what eliminates our curiosity, so to speak? Because we're doing this because we're curious about death and dying. I don't know
Sure,
more about it. But
sure.
you're saying at the moment of death we're not going to care anymore. Why is that?
Well, I wouldn't say we're not going to care. It's simply that I think questions we naturally have a curiosity about things, but often that curiosity comes from a place of separation, and um, so I think questions come from a place of feeling separate around death. When we're no longer separate, I think the questions aren't relevant because often the questions are symptomatic of some kind of separation, some kind of um, lack of unity, some deficiency, and so I think death is the ultimate fulfillment for any deficiencies. So that's why death is beyond any questions and any answers, because it's beyond all separation. So it's a meta perspective from which these other perspectives just aren't relevant. At least
Well,
that's my idea. Yeah.
I think you could usefully compare death to marriage, for instance,
That's
which
true.
is
That's true. I mean, once you walk down the aisle, right, all those questions fade away.
exactly, they do fade away because you're in the experience of marriage and you're not
You're,
worried about all the questions you had about marriage beforehand, whether you're going to have a good life together, whether you're compatible, whether you really love each other. All that stuff becomes irrelevant to a
right.
certain extent at the moment of when you're saying your vows. So
Uh-huh.
how is death unlike marriage for this purpose?
Well, it's interesting that the writer Dorothy Sayers said that death was her ultimate wedding night. So there
Oh,
is a connection between death and marriage. Although some people would say marriage is a kind of death, right?
I don't know if you'd say that while you're sitting right next to your wife, but
No, but that has been true for us, isn't that right,
hasn't it?
honey?
Well, new questions have emerged.
so my question is, Steve, do you envision on the other side of death that at some point these questions will reemerge and that we're just lost in the overwhelming nature of death as the single most overwhelming experience we'll ever have? Um, once that sort of the shock waves of that die down, so to speak, will we then be interested in have these same questions arise then as part of our inherent nature, or are you saying the questions will be eliminated for all time, or can you
Uh,
even answer a question like that?
well, I can't answer it with any confidence since I haven't been dead yet. But I think because death is the dissolution of the entity we take ourselves to be, and questions arise from that entityhood, that questions in the entityhood disappear together. They're intertwined. They're
Yeah.
constellations of the same fabric. So when that fabric unweaves, so do the questions and answers that arise from that entity.
Right, but there's a question in my mind as whether we are not still an entity even after death. Whether we're not, I mean, if on any understanding of the survival of life after death, there's some characterization of us as some kind of entity, whether it's a energy pattern or a soul or some kind of spirit or some kind of ghost. There's always some understanding of us as a separate entity. If you give credence to the people who say there is life after death, so the entity doesn't necessarily disappear. Maybe it's possible that if the entity doesn't disappear, then these questions will reemerge if maybe in a different way. Maybe they'll determine our karma, for instance.
That's true. Although, if our entityhood doesn't remain in the same form, then the questions that are asked may change as well.
That's what I was talking about.
Okay.
Is that the questions you may come up with different questions. They're not the same questions that you may have during a life experience about death.
Well,
the questions that come up from the death, being in the death process.
Because it represents a different perspective.
Right.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I would go along with that. So assuming that there is some entityhood that survives death, then, yeah, I'd agree that, the questions may change.
The questions may change, but you could also say that it's our very purpose in life to make sure that the questions link up. Otherwise, we're paying attention to the wrong things. It's like Scrooge.
Mm-hmm.
Scrooge's problem was that what he thought was important was not money, was not important at all, and the things that he thought were unimportant, relationships with people and loving other people, was important. So, and it's also the same thing about deathbed regrets, where people say they universally care about, when they have near-death experiences, they usually don't care about whether they made enough money or had a good enough job. They care about whether they loved other people. So, the question is always to link up the view of what's important from the point of view of life with the view of what's important from the point of death.
Right.
Well, it begs the question for me of does any of that really matter then? Whether it's, did you love well enough? Did you make enough money? Anything that happened during life, then does that really make a difference in the death process, in the sense of, from what I've heard you say before, it might have something to do with the karmic aspect of it. So if you made a lot of money and you did a lot of bad things, does that affect the questions you may have that may come during death because of what the karmic pattern then presents? Versus, say, you had a really good life, you loved well. Not saying that you can't love well with a lot of money either, but would those necessarily then have different questions if it depends on what kind of life you've led? And should that, I say should, but why would that even make a difference in the death process?
Well, if you look at what we think is important during life and what we're thinking might be important to us in death, if you're saying that there's no link there, then we're even more clueless than we think we are.
Yeah, well, I think that's probably true.
but the whole point of all our philosophizing during life, you could say, is to find out what's important from the point of view of its end. And so there has to be some wisdom that we're trying to gather, even if it's Steve, even if it's the wisdom of your trans-dual, non-experience, discursive experience. We're not. We're experiencing this. We're really experiencing from our total being and not from our mental centers. But at least part of the game of life, as it's traditionally been understood, is to figure out what's important on death and to live your life as if with the reality of your death and your death's reality in mind.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I would also say we can be discriminating in terms of the questions we ask and where those questions are coming from. Oftentimes our questions about do we survive death is a way of giving comfort to ourselves and not acknowledging the fact that we're really scared to die.
Yeah.
So oftentimes there's an emotional motivation for our questions, and we're seeking relief from that uncomfortable emotional situation.
Right, using it as a defense.
Yeah. Whereas you might say, a purer motivation might be, well, I simply want to know. I'm curious. I want to know what's on the other end of this journey.
Right.
Which can be coming from a very different place.
Well, on that note, on that brilliant reply, I think we've given our audience quite a bit to chew on for this week. And we'll return next week with another episode of Death Digest with Kim, Steve, and Paul.
All right.
Thank you and good night.
Thank you.